When the U.S. administration launched its most aggressive legal trade move against Canada since the Great Depression, Washington expected one of two reactions: immediate capitulation or a loud, angry public meltdown. Instead, Canada responded with complete, disciplined silence. This graphic breaks down the scale of Washington's move in July 2026. The White House abruptly slapped 50% tariffs on roughly $20 billion worth of Canadian imports annually, and it targeted a staggering 554 separate product categories, covering everything from imported vehicles and dairy to raw lumber. To pull this off without triggering a lengthy congressional approval process or national security review, the administration had to dig deep into the legal archives. Following this timeline back, they bypassed modern trade laws entirely and resurrected Section 338, a statutory authority buried inside the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930. Over 1,000 economists publicly begged President Herbert Hoover not to sign Smoot-Hawley. He signed it anyway, and the legislation helped collapse global trade by 65% between 1929 and 1934. Section 338 had sat dormant, collecting legal dust for nearly a century, until it was weaponized against Canada. Faced with a penalty of this magnitude, Canada's Prime Minister Mark Carney gathered every provincial premier behind closed doors. When he emerged, he refused to outline a single detail of his retaliation plan. He didn't issue threats, he didn't schedule a press conference. In high-stakes economic chess, the player who reveals their defensive move first surrenders their leverage. By keeping Ottawa's counterattack completely hidden, Carney forced Washington to guess how and when the damage would arrive. To understand exactly how much leverage Canada holds, you have to look past the items Washington tariffed and examine the specific resources the administration deliberately excluded from the proclamation. This map illustrates exactly where the vulnerability lies. Energy products were entirely exempted, and for good reason. Canada supplies 64% of all crude oil imported by the United States. That is a massive daily flow of heavy crude moving directly into the American industrial base. American refineries in the Midwest are physically engineered and calibrated over decades to process this specific grade of Canadian heavy crude. They cannot simply buy oil from somewhere else tomorrow. Switching suppliers would require billions of dollars in infrastructure retrofits and years of downtime. The White House also exempted critical minerals essential for defense systems, as well as potash. Canada is the world's largest producer of potash, a mineral strictly required for agricultural fertilizer. Without affordable Canadian supply, American food production costs would spike immediately. By preemptively carving out energy, tech materials, and agriculture before negotiations even began, Washington mapped out its own weaknesses. They proved that Canada holds deep, inescapable structural leverage over the American economy. With its retaliation hidden, Ottawa simply had to let time do the work. The first clock ticking down is legal. Relying on a 96-year-old statute that predates the World Trade Organization leaves the administration heavily exposed. Legal scholars quickly argued that modern trade laws have rendered Section 338 functionally obsolete, and we already know how the courts view this. In February 2026, the U.S. Supreme Court struck down the administration's previous favorite emergency tariff tool, ruling that broad, unilateral presidential power requires explicit congressional approval. Looking at this map, you can see 36 individual U.S. states lighting up. That represents every state that relies on Canada as its single largest export market. This is the second ticking clock: intense domestic political pressure. The North American supply chain is deeply integrated. Slapping 50% tariffs on raw materials like lumber and dairy doesn't punish Canadian exporters as much as it inflates costs for American homebuilders and supermarkets at every stage of production. If Canada fired back publicly with matching tariffs, the administration could point to Ottawa as the enemy, rallying voters around a tough bilateral trade fight. But because Carney stayed quiet, he denied Washington that political oxygen. Silence traps the administration into fighting itself. As domestic industries start flooding Congress with complaints about rising expenses, the narrative organically shifts from a tough foreign policy victory to a story of domestic economic self-sabotage. While Washington's attention was fixed entirely on an arbitrary August tariff deadline, Ottawa was operating on a much longer timeline. Carney had already initiated a decade-long structural strategy to double Canada's non-U.S. exports to over $400 billion by 2035. He spent early 2026 quietly securing a preliminary trade agreement with China and pushing forward a massive free trade deal with the ASEAN nations. And Canada finally has the physical infrastructure to make that pivot a reality. With the completion of the Trans Mountain Expansion Pipeline, Canadian crude oil flows in massive volumes directly to Asian markets, completely bypassing United States soil. On the same morning a president dismissed the trade agreement's value on national television, Canada's trade minister arrived in Washington for meetings kept strictly away from media access. One side is managing a morning news cycle, the other is managing the next decade of structural positioning. By resurrecting a Depression-era weapon for a short-term political win, Washington accelerated the very diversification strategy that reduces its own leverage. The attempt to seize $20 billion in trade forced a patient neighbor to permanently move its leverage elsewhere.